All right, guys, so we're to the wiring. And this is like the fourth video I've put together. And I didn't really care for the other versions. And I figured it would actually be a better video if I set up a demo engine and show how to wire it. So this wiring harness is actually basically what's going through the firewall of the car. And we're just going to consider it being there on the chair. So I want to concentrate on getting wires to the sensors. All right, guys, I want to take 1 second. Just stop what you're doing and listen. All the 12 volts that are coming to various sensors, and like the coils, the injectors, the fast idle valve, we want to make sure that none of those have 12 volt power until we're ready for them to have 12 volt power. And we don't want them to do that until we get a good base tune on the Microsquirt, and then we will individually start powering stuff on and making sure that nothing is going wrong. I have actually fried multiple coils because the settings were wrong and it was giving an inverted signal, which means that it was getting 5 volts to it and this thing was charging, just sitting there. And these things stink when they start burning. They smell like burnt electrical wire. And it's hard to get rid of, and you basically just burn them up. So, another thing, while I have everybody's attention, if you have not watched the first video and the second video all the way through, go back and do that. Because they cover various things that you have to do to this engine to make the Microsquirt work correctly. If you are at this point where the motor is in the car and you're ready to wire and you haven't watched those other videos, you've made a mistake. Because you have to get down to the crank timing gear and we have to do stuff to that. So go back and watch that. And if you have watched all them videos all the way through, then we should be ready to wire. All right. And I'll do a rundown real quick of the sensors that we're going to be using. We are not going to use the cam sensor. So this plug is not going to be used. We are not going to use the knock sensor. We're going to use all 6 coils on both banks. All 6 injectors. The coolant temp. The crank. And the VTEC. And then on the upper intake manifold, we're going to have the MAT, which is manifold air temperature, the IAC, or the fast idle valve, the MAP, and the TPS. And then we are going to have the alternator plug. So, a few things first. Let's kind of go over the wiring. There's 2 different ways that I prefer to do these, and that's to take the wire all the way to the plug and then actually put these pins on this wire with a seal and then de-pin these plugs and actually pin this wire into that plug. That is by far the best way that you can possibly do this. Now, there are certain spots that you will need to use these butt connectors. And usually that's whenever a wire is being shared between sensors or grounds are coming together or hots are being shared. So an example of this, all 3 injectors on bank 2, the front is actually bank 2, they will all share a hot and they will all share a ground that goes to the micro. And the same thing with bank 1. They will all share a hot, and then they'll share a ground. And then the same thing with the coils. They'll share a hot between all 6 of them. They'll share a ground between all 6 of them. And then 2 coils will share the 3rd wire that goes to the micro. And then you'll have sensor grounds that are shared. And I believe that is it. Oh, 5 volt reference. So Some people will want to do just the pigtails, and that's fine. That's actually how I'm going to show it in this video. You can run the terminals all the way. I don't blame you. This is just a faster way to show how to get this done. Doing the pins, the terminals, it takes a lot more time. And to be honest, I'm trying to keep this video short, and that video would be hours long. I usually set up one day just to do terminals. And then wiring this, if you're doing butt connectors, I mean, you can scoot right through it. One thing I will note about this, I'm not going to show it, but whenever I do the butt connectors, I put heat shrink on them. I never use black tape. I use heat shrink. And then whenever I do the heat shrink, I will go over it with liquid tape and make sure that it's sealed. I'll go over it with this, and then the next day, after letting it dry overnight, I will come back out and I will look at it and make sure that it's sealed all the way around. If it's not, I will put another layer of liquid tape around it. I absolutely want my harnesses waterproof. I had like a B16 buggy. I followed these same rules. I went mudding constantly, had that thing completely underwater a few times. I never had an issue out of the wiring on that thing. So, I'm going to show how to do the butt connectors, but I expect everybody to do the pins. I'm hoping that they will, and then we won't have any issues later. So, I like to start this with the intake manifold off, and for most of you, for all of you, put tape over this. I'm not going to do it because this engine is actually trash. It had some knock and boost and blew a piston out. So I'm not too worried about this one. We're going to start off with the injectors first, and we're going to go from there. Kind of do the easy stuff first, and then at the very end, we will do the ignition. The ignition takes a little bit longer. It's a little bit harder concept to understand, and I'm going to spend a little bit more time explaining everything and how the micro actually makes it all work. So let's get started. Okay, so I want to start out with the injectors. The injectors have two wires. They have a hot, which is this yellow-black wire. And being that we're going to tie all three of these together, we are going to power them by one of the hots coming in. Now I usually run 4 to 5 hots, and you know, it doesn't hurt to have spares, but you don't want to be short any. You don't want to have to pull more wires to the firewall. So 4 or 5 hots, just call it 5, have different colors. So like this is blue, have a red. Red's so common to be a hot though, that I like to have different colors. So you know, you can use red, blue, green, purple, you know. And you can get these striped colors off of eBay. And you can get like 10 different colors and, you know, get 10 foot of it. It's pretty cheap. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring in the 5 amp hot from the fuse panel. And we're going to tie this to one injector. That, crimp that up. At this point, put your heat shrink on, and then we're going to tie these two together, and then we're going to connect all 4 of those together just like that. And you will notice that I have to flip these pliers around. It's actually bigger on this side and smaller on this side, and that's because these are actually made for the terminal connections. Okay, so next up is the 3 wires that need to go to the micro. We're going to do the exact same thing we did for the hots. These are just the grounds. So we're going to tie these two first ones together. And I'm probably just going to do this on the injectors, and then we'll kind of walk through the other sensors. They're quite a bit easier. So then we're going to get the injector bank 1 wire. Now we tied the hot to the other one, so this is technically a ground. And we're going to tie these two together. Put your heat shrink and everything on there. And I would like to point out that after I was done with my harness, I went through and taped all these up to keep the wires tight and where I wanted them. So just like that. And then I de-pinned all these and put the wrap around them. It is very time consuming. Even whenever I did the individual terminals, I still did it that way because I wanted to know if I messed something up, I didn't have to cut all of it open, because that did happen to me on one time. So this time I just de-pin everything, slide the sleeve on, and I use heat shrink on the ends of them and call it good. Now, I also like to do this because I like to run all the sensors. So like these could be run down here. Well, I can actually tie these into that same harness, and this is basically all the back head. So you'll have to figure out how you want to cover the wires. That's up to you. Everybody's different. Some people like to hide their wires, so they might actually go down underneath the intake manifold. Like I said, that's completely up to you. So let's get on to the next sensor. Let's go ahead and cover the VTEC solenoid. This is 1 wire, and this is going to be the A LED wire. Now we can go ahead and bring that wire all the way here, and you can either use a butt connector here, or you can just go ahead and, do the pin. And then some of you who have seen the video, you will notice that we aren't doing a relay right here. Well, we're going to do the relay with the Microsquirt in the car. And I had that pin out on the first video of this guide. So if you haven't seen that, go back, watch it. Watch all of the parts all the way through, because there's very important information in those. The pinouts are all in those, and the crank gear is in that one. So let's talk about the VR sensor. And if you're looking at this, the blue wire is the VR1 positive. And the white wire here is going to be the VR1 negative. The VR1 is the only one we're going to use. The VR2 is actually used for a cam sensor. On this motor, we don't need to use it. Now, if you've seen the other video, you'll notice that we need to put a 10K resistor in line with the VR1 positive. Now, I'm going to show you a solder-in resistor right now. And we can either solder that in this line, or you can use butt connectors. Make sure it's all sealed up. Make sure that you seal this up. It's very important. You do not want anything corrupting this signal or tampering with this signal at all. That's how you literally kill the engine. It'll just stall out. The micro will lose sync with the crank, and it won't know where the crank is actually at until the next revolution. So it'll be like you cut 3 cylinders off, and then it might pick up on the next spin of the crank. I want to take a brief second and just ask, if you enjoy these videos or find them useful, give me a thumbs up. I appreciate it. And leave a comment for any future video suggestions that you have. Let's get back to it. All right, so let's go over the coil wiring. Now, this is probably the most complicated part of this swap, basically because cylinders tied to each other, the way they numbered them, the way they lettered them, they kind of did some confusing stuff. So I'm just going to walk you through it real slow. So to start out, we have the pin out, and we have this black yellow wire. That is the 12 volt hot. We're going to bring that from a 15 amp fuse from the back. This is going to be one of the hot wires I was talking about earlier. That's a different color. And what we're going to do is we're going to tie this in. What I like to do is bring my coil wiring right to the V, and then I'll cut it right here and I'll start splitting it. This power wire goes to all 6 coils. The 3 in the front, 3 in the back. And it runs by a 15 amp fuse. So once we get all that tied together, we'll run the grounds right along with it. Try to keep the wiring organized. Keep these 3 wires together. Keep these 3 wires together. And I'll kind of show you how mine is. So mine's wired like this. So the shortest one to where they all join is this one, the next longest, and then the longest. And the same with the back. That keeps me from getting coils mixed up. So I suggest you do the same, but that's up to you. So once we get all the grounds tied together, we're actually going to use a mount that is on the front of the engine. Now this mount goes right here, and it just so happens there's a 10 millimeter bolt right there that we can tie the ground into. That's the perfect spot because we can bring all those grounds together and ground them right there in the V. Now, let's get to the more complicated part. So, since we're doing a wasted spark setup, we have cylinders 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So 1 and 5 pistons are actually at top dead center at the same time. Now 1 is starting the power stroke, the piston firing and going down. And then this one, 5, is actually finishing and expelling the gas out. So even though the pistons are in the same spots on the block, they're actually on the opposite side of the 4-stroke cycle. So what we can do is we can set this up as a wasted spark to where 1 and 5 fire at the same time, 3 and 4 fire at the same time, and 2 and 6 fire at the same time. Now, you might be looking at your Microsquirt and looking at the pin out, and you got pin 11, which is ignition 2, pin 12 is ignition 1, but there's no other ignition on here. Well, we can change the WLED pin 17 to an ignition. And how we do that, if you watch the very first Microsquirt guide, we wire in a 1K quarter watt resistor. Now what that does is we have the wire coming from the Microsquirt going to cylinder 6, and that's going to go to the far right pin. On this one it's black and red, and we're going to tie into this. Now normally the WLED can only be a ground. Now what we are doing is we are putting 5 volts into this line. We're going to tie that resistor, that 1K resistor, into the 5 volt line. So inside of the car, we will actually jump from this wire to this wire with that resistor. What that does is it puts 5 volts into this wire. It's a very small amount. The amperage is super small. It's small enough that this can ground it out and completely make the signal go back to the micro. So this coil will actually not see 5 volts, even though the 5 volts is jumping across. It'll take the path of least resistance and ground out to the micro. Now, how the micro can use that is that the micro controls that ground. So it will actually ground it out. From the moment the key's on, it will ground it. And then whenever you start the engine and it needs this coil to fire, it will temporarily remove that ground. And that will send the 5 volts over this wire and to the coil. Now, that coil will start charging, and you can overcharge these. In the micro, they call that dwell time. So, and dwell time has been a thing since the old days. It's not anything new. It's just a term of how long a coil is charging. So, once it charges, say 1 millisecond, the micro will reapply the ground. So, this coil only sees that 5 volt signal for 1 millisecond. Extremely fast. When it removes that and reapplies that ground, that coil fires. And some of you might remember points, and it's basically the same thing. You hit it, and then as soon as you pull it, it fires. So 2 and 6 are going to be tied together on the wire closest to the snap. Now, that's the hardest part. So you may have to kind of rewind it, watch that part again, and watch as many times. If you have any questions, let me know in the comments, and I will try to answer them or get another video out further explaining what's going on. All right, so I want to go ahead and cover the alternator before we cover everything up. And the alternator has this black yellow wire. This is a hot. So I run this as a key on hot. And then these other 3 wires, I just put some heat shrink over the ends of them and then tape them up in the harness and get rid of them. Now, one of these is a warning light. The other one goes to the ECU, and I believe the other one goes to the ELD. And we're not going to use any of them. If you want to figure out the wiring or the warning light, you can go ahead and do that. But to be honest, it's kind of pointless. If you have an alternator issue, if you open Tuner Studios, you will be able to see that your alternator is not charging. So you can just look at the battery voltage that's coming into the micro. If it's, 9 volts, you know your alternator's not working. So I wanted to get that out of the way. And let's go ahead and do the CLT. Now the CLT is a 2-wire sensor, and 1 is a sensor ground. Now I like to go off of this plug, and I tie that to the sensor ground. This one will be the coolant wire, or CLT. They've changed their wiring, so sometimes their names are a little bit different, but it'll say coolant or CLT, coolant temp. And the same, you can run it straight to the plug, or you can use butt connectors. This sensor ground is going to be shared by a few other sensors. You have the manifold air temperature sensor, you have the TPS, and the MAP. So remember, we're going to end up splicing into this wire. All right, so now that we got the intake on, let's go over the first sensor, and that is the idle air control valve. Now, the idle air control valve is a 3-wire sensor, and it's a 12-volt sensor. So it's got an engine ground, not a sensor ground. The engine ground is on the very top here. And then we have the power, which is the middle. Now, I did a key on power for that. And then we have the micro pin down here. Now, that's going to go to F idle, which means fast idle. And this is one of those sensors that's kind of hard to find settings for. So we just basically play around with it. What I actually like doing is actually unbolting this off the throttle body. And then I will go in the micro in the test mode, and I will play with the settings until it's all the way open and then all the way closed. And then I know the values that I need to be within for it to idle up when it's cold and then slowly idle down whenever it's warm. And then once I get a decent tune on it, then I will go in there and I will fine tune this for probably a week until I get it exactly where I want it. So let's go over the next sensors. Now we have the TPS and we have the MAP. These are both 3-wire sensors, and they both share the 5-volt reference and a sensor ground. Okay. So the MAP sensor has the signal wire, which is all the way to the right here, which is this yellow black. And then we have the 5-volt reference. Now this is going to be shared with the TPS. And then we have the sensor ground on the left, which is also going to be shared with the TPS. So a lot of times I will wrap this around and get those wires tied together. Leave yourself some slack here though. You don't want them so tight that, you know, you're basically pulling on these wires. You'll eventually just damage the wires or pull the terminals out. So the pin out for the TPS, we have the sensor ground is this green wire. The signal is in the middle this time, and the 5-volt reference is on the outside, the yellow here. So you can see it kind of flip-flopped. All right, so let's cover the last sensor, and that is the manifold air temp sensor. Now, just like the coolant temp sensor, I like to keep the ground on the plug side, and this is also a sensor ground. So you can see that, you know, you end up with a few sensor grounds here. And then this will be the intake air temp. It'll say IAT or MAT, meaning manifold air temp. And I will explain something here. These things are really bad about heat soaking. Whenever you're in the drive-thru, say McDonald's or going to Walmart or whatever, and you don't spend a lot of time in there, what you'll notice is the heat will actually come up the lowers and start heating this up. And then all of a sudden you start reading elevated air temps. Now, on most cars, that's not going to be an issue, especially if you're NA and you're just running a stock motor and an EG, whatever. But for me, I'm boosted. So whenever I see super high intake temps, I like to pull timing. I like to keep it on the safe side. Just go ahead and pull it. This is a problem for me because while I'm at the drag strip, I might be waiting in line for 45 minutes, 2 hours. You know, you never know. Stuff happens at the drag strip. People blow their stuff up on the track and, you know, then you're waiting. So I switch that out. I actually run a GM 2-wire and I run it in the intake track, probably 6 inches away from the throttle body. And this is an open element sensor. So this one reacts quite a bit faster. And it just so happens I bought this on Amazon and they actually gave me the Microsquirt readings, the ohms. So that was pretty cool. This is actually the temperature sensor that's in there. And you can see that it's kind of covered up. Well, that means it's a slightly slower reacting sensor. By the time that I was at the end of the track, there was enough airflow through there that it actually started cooling this down. And by the time I was letting off at the end of the track, I was back to normal air temperatures. So I actually pulled timing during the entire track run and just didn't get anywhere. So another thing I want to cover here is the sensor on the thermostat housing. Now this is the same plug as the air temp and the CLT temp, the coolant temp. This is your fan switch. So you'll have a relay in the car with maybe a key hot, and the power will go through the coil side of the relay, and then the ground you will bring out here and run to this. Now it doesn't matter which one you go with, but you know, following my theme, I would go to the red here, and then I would wrap this around and go to that 10 millimeter right there. I also bring my 2 grounds from the micro, and I ground them out right there. I like to stick with, you know, what I know, and I knew the factory ECU was grounded out right there, so I ground this ECU out right there. So another thing I want to cover is the E85 flex fuel sensor. This is a 12 volt sensor. It is labeled on the sensor, so this is really easy to wire in. You have the VCC, which is a power, and I run that straight to the same power that I was using on the fast auto valve. And then I have a ground, which I go to the engine ground, and then the out, which goes to the flex wire. If you ever plan on running E85, go ahead, spend the $100, do that. It's easy to set up, and you'll never look back. The only other sensor that I can think of off the top of my head is the O2 sensor. Now, O2s change between makes and models. They might be more standard nowadays, but back whenever I bought mine, there was stuff just, I don't know what they were doing. I guess the standards weren't created or something. I use an LC2, and you probably can't see it. Right here is one of the wires. That's a brown wire. That's like a narrow band signal. So whatever you end up doing, one of the power wires you bring up here is going to power your wideband, unless you have your wideband controller inside the car. Go ahead and do the wiring in there. Follow the instruction manuals with your particular wideband. And then the wire on the harness, I believe, is going to be a pink wire. It will say O2 on it. So you just need that one wire going to the O2. Now, whenever we're in tuner studios, if if we can't get readings from 10 AFR to 20 AFR, I think is the range of mine. If we're getting like 13 to 14, then we have the wrong wire hooked up. Because that's like narrow band signals. It'd be like 1 AFR difference, or if it's acting up, we might look into that. So I think that'll cover everything, guys. Just, like, share, and subscribe to friends that might find this interesting, or they might be interested in doing a J-swap, and they're just trying to piece together the prices and freaking out and saying, how can they afford that? This is a good alternative. The Del Sols at 500 horse, the micro was not a setback. The micro did not hold that thing from making any more power. I'm on stock manifolds, and that's a severe choke point to that motor. And then I'm actually out of injector. So it wasn't a micro issue. It was multiple other issues. And most people that have contacted me, they just want to get this motor running in buggies and other cars, like 240s or whatever. I've had a few Civic requests, so this works. It's cheap. You can't be afraid of the wiring side of it. All right, so that's going to bring this video to an end. Remember, like, share, and subscribe. And if you need something explained in further detail, just leave it in the comments, and I'll try to get around to it. Thanks. What are you still doing here? Oh, well, since you're here, let's go over a few things. We got the engine and transmission back in for the second time. And while I was out breaking the motor in this weekend, we hit 150,000 miles. So we'll have to figure out how to celebrate that. But in the meantime, I went ahead. I have the H-beams in this motor. We went ahead and upgraded the valve springs and retainers. We went through the transmission, made sure everything was good. While we were in the motor, we went ahead and did the rings, the bearings, timing belt, water pump, all that good stuff. We went ahead and upgraded the rear suspension to some stiffer springs, so hopefully she won't squat so much now. And I will probably get her back on the dyno. If you guys want to see that, just let me know. I'll try to record more of it. I didn't get as much last time I went. And once we get started on the hatch, and I know I will not be taking this to the track anymore, we're going to go ahead and get some new rims and get the side skirts put back on. I actually run without the side skirts because whenever I'm running these slicks, they rub them and I don't want them tore up. And I probably ought to put the caps on the wheels. So, all right, guys, we'll see you in the next video.